right. Okay, so I'm going to pick up where we were last time. We're struggling with what is called the mind-body problem. What's the relationship between the mind and the body? Now, let me remind you, there are two parts to the course. There's the first part of the course where we do what I like to call mainstream philosophy of mind. And there you're going to hear about all these theories, about token identity theory and functionalism and the computational model of the mind and Turing machines and all that kind of stuff. And that's where I teach you what I guess you'd be taught at any university in the United States. You wouldn't have to come to Berkeley for that. But in the second half of the course, I talk about what I think is actually more interesting, namely, how does the mind actually work? What is the right project for psychology and other mental disciplines, cognitive science in particular. Cognitive science is a fascinating discipline, and I will say something about the foundations of cognitive science later on. All right, now last time we were examining dualism, and we found it unsatisfactory. Now there is a form of dualism that we didn't really criticize, and that is so-called property dualism, and I put this map of the territory on the blackboard. Dualism, you remember, is the view that there are two kinds of things in the universe, mental things and physical things. The most famous kind, exemplified by Descartes, says there are two kinds of substances in the universe, mental substances and physical substances. And I won't go through the whole story again. Mental substances are defined by their essence, which is thinking, by which he means consciousness. And physical substances have an essence, namely extension, by which he means extended in space. Now, there are famous difficulties with dualism, and I went over them last time, so I won't go over them again. But basically, substance dualism is pretty scarce nowadays. As far as I know, the substance dualists I know are all substance dualists for some religious reason. Or rather, that begs the question. They hold their substance dualism as part of a religious view of reality. The idea being that when their body dies, they will continue to exist because their soul, as they say in New Orleans, will go marching on. And the soul is what they are really. It's a separate substance. Okay, now that is a rare view among professional philosophers. I pointed this out in a book I wrote, and somebody wrote to me and said, no, there's a woman in Switzerland who is a substance dualist who's also an atheist. Well, okay, congratulations. So there may be I went and visited her. She invited me to give a lecture there, and I didn't have the nerve to ask her, are you a substance dualist while being an atheist? I should have. But in any case, substance dualism is rare today, but property dualism seems to be making some kind of a comeback. What property dualism says is, well, there really are irreducible mental phenomena, but they're not entities, they're not objects, they're not things. It's just that there is a property that normal brains have, namely, sometimes they're conscious. And that sounds pretty good to me. That sounds right. I'm sometimes accused of property dualism, so we're going to have to say more about that later when I tell you my own views. But the dominant view over the past half a century has been some version of materialism. And in today's lecture, I'm going to go through all of the standard, I'm going to go through most of the standard versions of materialism. And the materialist says, contrary to the dualist, there aren't two kinds of things in the universe. There's only one kind of thing, and that's matter. Matter, as described by the physical sciences, is what the universe is constructed of. The universe consists entirely in physical particles in fields of force, and there are no irreducible mental phenomena. But then that raises the question, well, what are we talking about when we say that people have hopes and fears and beliefs and desires, that they have pains and tickles and itches, that they have aspirations and feelings? What is all of that talk about? And that is the problem that the materialist faces is how to make sense of our talk of psychological phenomena and how to make sense out of psychology and other disciplines that deal with the mind in a materialist world. We're given a materialist vision. And the history is very interesting, the history of this, because basically there are a series of attempts to present a consistent materialist account, but they always run into the same set of difficulties. They always seem to leave out something crucial. They leave out the mind. All right, so now we're going to go through the steps. We're going to go through this drama of how the materialist faces, confronts, and in my opinion fails to meet the objections having to do with facts about the mind. But I want you always to see these philosophical theories against the background of the overall vision. The vision that the dualist has is we are really mental or spiritual or psychological entities somehow in a physical world. The materialist thinks, no, if you believe in psychological entities, if you think there really are such things as irreducible pains and tickles and itches and qualitative feelings, if you think that there are these things that can't be eliminated, they can't be gotten rid of by scientific analysis, if you think that, then you are rejecting the past 300 years of civilization and scientific progress. You're back in bed with Descartes, and maybe even worse. You're back in cahoots with Cardinal Bellarmine, busy threatening Galileo with torture if he did not abandon his heretical views. So you've got to understand that this goes on against a history, and the history, as the people on the materialist side see it, is a history of the progressive advance of rationality and intelligence and, above all, science in the face of superstition. And superstition takes its form in dualism. In just about any intellectual culture in the world, if you can show that a view leads to Cartesianism, you will have succeeded in refuting the view. The one exception is France. I frequently lecture in France, and I sometimes say, but that's a type of Cartesianism. And they, yeah, sure thing, they don't mind. But anyway, they're all brought up on this. As I told you, they teach philosophy in the lycée. They teach it for the baccalaureate exam. I dread to think of the philosophy they teach, for God's sake. Last summer when I was in Paris, they had a question on consciousness, and the reading on consciousness was not neurobiology, but it was Searle and Heidegger and other great brain scientists. Well, that's not my way of teaching this subject, so I dread to think what is taught. However, it does have certain advantages. If you go into the men's room of any good lycée in Paris, you will find variations, obscene variations on Descartes' Je pense donc je suis. I'll let you do this research on your own. But in any case, I don't know how we got sidetracked onto that, but now we're going to go back and talk about materialism. Before I do that, one more footnote. I haven't talked about idealism. Idealism is a view that reality is ultimately mental. When you talk about idealism, it doesn't mean these people have high ideals. It means they think the only things that really exist are ideas, are mental phenomena. And if you do the history of Western philosophy, idealism has had a prodigious influence. I mean, it doesn't seem to me even remotely plausible to say that the only things that exist are states of consciousness, actual and possible. That to say, well, really, there's something in this bag that no one is looking, is just to say, well, if we did look in, we would have a certain sense data. We would perceive certain sense data. But idealism has been prodigiously influential. And some of the famous idealists you should know about. I guess Hegel, well, Berkeley invented the modern version of idealism. Again, though, like all these things, it goes back to the Greeks. There's a sense in which Plato, I think, is correctly described as an idealist. But Berkeley is an idealist, and then the most influential ones have been Hegel in the 19th century, and in the English-speaking world, Bradley, and in this university, Josiah Royce. And actually, one of the best books, if you want to read it, is Royce's book on the sources of modern idealism. And he tries to make the case plausible. He doesn't make it plausible to me, but at least it's intelligible. It's intelligible how people could have believed that ultimately reality is mental. Ultimately, reality is spiritual. All right, but I'm not going to say anything about that. As far as I know, it is totally without influence today. I don't know anybody who says in public, I am an idealist. I know some people who might be idealists, but they don't confess it. Okay, so we're going to talk about materialism. Now, the earliest form of materialism was behaviorism. But let me stop for questions. Remember, this is the way I lecture. I talk for a while, then we stop for questions. I have a drink of water, and then I talk some more. So let's. Any questions so far? We're now leaving Cartesian dualism. We'll come back to property dualism, but right now I'm going to spend the whole of today's lecture essentially going through different versions of materialism, both the arguments for them and the arguments against them. Any questions so far? Yes? Basically, there are a series of... About what?
Causally closed.
Causally closed, yeah. The reasons why dualism failed in one sentence is that nobody could give a coherent account of the relationships between the mental and the physical. Descartes himself admits that he can't explain how the mental and the physical interact. He says that the mind is not in the body the way a pilot is in the ship. It's as if the mind were suffused throughout the body, but that can't make any sense on his own account, because his own account says the mind can't have any spatial dimensions. It can't have any extension. And that's, well, I don't know that. Okay, so there are poltergeists working on us here. I honestly don't know what happened. How about that? Magic. Okay. Now, the question, though, the direct question is very important, and that is, what does it mean to say the physical world is causally closed? Now, what people mean when they say that is, if there is something in addition to the physical world, there are some mental states or mental properties, they can't make any difference. So people who believe in property dualism typically are forced to the view, well, we do have mental states, they're caused by brain processes, but they can't themselves cause anything because the physical world is causally closed. In this sense, nothing can come out from outside the physical world that's not itself physical and interfere with anything that happens in the physical world. Now, that leads them to some views that I think are extremely implausible, not to say preposterous, but the idea is, if the physical universe is here and there's something out here in left field that's not physical, there's no way that this mental entity, this spiritual beast, can get inside here, because this thing only operates on physical causes, and mental states, if they are not reducible to physical phenomena, cannot act causally. Now, I said that led to implausible results. It leads to epiphenomenalism, the view that your mental states exist, but they are epiphenomena. I won't write it on the blackboard because I always get stuck on about the third syllable. But the idea of epiphenomenalism is, yes, you do have mental states, but they can't cause anything. So when I told you the story, I decide to raise my arm and the damned arm goes up, I might have the illusion that my mental decision caused the arm to go up. But if we actually do a scientific analysis, we'll see exactly what caused the arm to go up was a series of neuron firings beginning in the motor cortex, where across each of the synaptic clefts, acetylcholine, the key a neurotransmitter involved in raising the arm caused the neuron to fire the next neuron in line until finally we reached the axon end plates of the motor neurons, and those activated the ion channels. And I won't tell you the whole damn story. You can look it up in any textbook. I didn't discover this. I just got it out of the textbooks. And that's what really caused your arm to go up. What really caused your arm to go up are a series of ordinary physical processes. The idea that the mind functions causally is not just false, but it's unintelligible because we cannot understand how anything not a part of the physical world could affect the physical world. That's what they mean when they say it's causally closed. Go ahead. Well, we know that it's causally closed because we have a conception of causation and a conception of a physical reality, according to which we can't make sense of the idea that something not a part of that reality can have causal effects. Now, of course, nobody can block miracles. Maybe if God exists, God decides, well, I'm going to make non-physical events cause things. But that's not part of we can't deal with that as philosophers and scientists. As philosophers and scientists, we have to deal with what we can actually understand. Yes?
Do you think that idealism requires the idea that you're the only person in the world?
No, here was a problem for idealism. How does idealism avoid solipsism? And I don't know, some idealist is trying to communicate with us, but that's a tough problem for the idealists. And the extreme solution is the Hegelian solution of absolute idealism that says our minds are just part of one great big mind called the absolute. And so we can avoid solipsism because though we do have a mind, our mind is just a little fragment of a great big huge mind, which is the absolute. And if we were undergraduates 100 years ago, we would know various dirty songs about the absolute. There's one that goes, "The absolute lives in a house of ill repute." Well, I won't sing this song for you, but anyway, you can do research on this. But anyway, that's absolute idealism. And the favorites of this are Hegel and Bradley. Bradley was a famous British idealist. But effectively, I think it's pretty much philosophically dead, and I'm in a way the wrong guy to try to explain it because it seems to me totally unsympathetic. It seems to me unappealing as a philosophical theory. If you ask yourself, what do philosophical theories, what are they supposed to account for, then it seems to me idealism doesn't meet the test. Now, there's a history of why idealism, and particularly absolute idealism, came about. And it's a history that goes from Descartes and his skepticism through Locke and Berkeley and Hume and Leibniz and Spinoza until it culminates in Kant. And Kant had a type of idealism which he called transcendental idealism, which says, yes, the only reality we can talk about are our own ideas, our own impressions and thoughts and feelings, mental contents. But behind that, there must be a reality which forms the ground of these representations, and that ground is the thing in itself. Things in themselves are there, but we can never know about them. So there's something that stands outside the mind, the thing in itself, but we can't know about it, we can't talk about it, we can't even say that it causes our mental states, because cause is itself a notion belonging to the realm of appearances. So for Kant, there is the reality of things in themselves which we can never know and never talk about, and then there's the world of appearances that we actually live in and can talk about. Now, what happened in subsequent philosophy after Kant was people thought, well, hell, if we can't say anything about this thing in themselves, about this reality that's the other side of our minds, then let's get rid of it. Just scrap it. And what we have left is just the reality, the mental reality. I'm giving. I feel a bit bashful giving you this short Reader's Digest history because, of course, it's much more complicated. But that's the basic structure. You go from Cartesian skepticism through various attempts to cope with it, finally culminating in Kant. And Kant was a hell of a philosopher. I mean, it is an extraordinary achievement. But the way that he solves the problem is to say, yes, we are locked into our experiences, but there is a reality on the other side of our experiences, the reality of things in themselves, but we can't know anything about it, we can't say anything about it. Then subsequent idealist philosophers said, well, let's get rid of things in themselves. The only reality we need is the reality we can know and talk about, and that's the reality of experience. So that's how the history led to absolute idealism. But all the same, it seems to me an extremely implausible theory. I find it, it's hard for me to lecture about it in a way that makes it sound attractive because I don't find it attractive. Okay, any other questions? Now we're going to go through them. Yes? Yeah. Well, okay.
Your thoughts and your mind is composed of different processes.
Yeah.
And you actually have some sort of influence. How is that not like
How is it possible? I am going to explain that in some detail when we talk about how I think the mind actually works. Here's the problem. If mental states are not reducible to physical states, they're really there, then how can they function causally? I said that my intention and action, my decision, caused my arm to go up, and I don't really have any doubts about that. I mean, I can get a sore arm just demonstrating this to myself all day long. But if my mental states cause my arm to go up, then how is that possible if the mental states are not reducible to physical states? And I have to give an explanation of that. I'm not going to do it yet because I don't have the tools, but we will get to that. Okay, materialism. We start with behaviorism. Now, in the early days, the early decades of the 20th century, there was an effort to put psychology, the discipline of psychology, on a serious scientific footing, to make a hard-nosed science out of psychology. And the idea that people had was that, well, if we're going to make it scientific, it has to study observable phenomena. But the only observable mental phenomena are in the form of human behavior. So psychology, if it is to be a scientific discipline, has to be a science of human behavior. This view is called behaviorism. But so far, the psychologists needn't say, well, do mental states exist in addition to behavior? The psychologist doesn't have to answer that question. The answer is, it doesn't matter, because for scientific purposes, all we are studying is the actual structure of human behavior. So the slogan was that psychology is a science of human behavior. And if you went back and looked in psychology textbooks from the 1950s, I'm pretty sure you would find this. When I was an undergraduate, it was a standard definition of psychology. Psychology is a science of human behavior. Now, this is called methodological behaviorism because it doesn't actually deny the existence of mental states in addition to behavior. It just says they're scientifically irrelevant, methodological. But there was a methodological behaviorism. But there was a tougher version of behaviorism that said, well, in fact, there aren't any mental states in addition to behavior. To talk about people's mental states is just to talk about their actual and possible behavior. And that is sometimes called analytic behaviorism or logical behaviorism. Why? Well, it's said that it's part of the logic of statements about the mental that they can be analyzed into, they can be entirely reduced to. They're equivalent in meaning to sets of statements about behavior. It needn't be actual behavior, but it could be possible behavior. So if you say, the guy believes that it's going to rain, what that means is not that he's right now carrying an umbrella, but rather if he goes outdoors, he will carry an umbrella. So the belief that he is that he believes it's going to rain or believes that it's raining, is equivalent in meaning to a set of statements about his behavior. For example, if he goes outdoors, he will carry an umbrella. He will close the windows in the house if they're open. If he owns a convertible, he'll put the top up or put the car in the garage, and he will engage in other sorts of behavior appropriate to having a belief. And this was the idea between analytic behaviorism, that any statement about the mind was equivalent in meaning to a set of statements about behavior, including statements of a hypothetical form. If such and such, then so and so. If he goes outdoors, he'll carry an umbrella. Yes? Well, that's the problem for the behaviors. The question is a very good question. The question is, but isn't the belief that it's raining a separate mental state? Now, that is, I think, the common sense objection. I'm going to be wrestling like Laocoon with this snake all the time. But anyway, here goes. And this was what these guys were trying to deal with. How can they get rid of the belief as a separate mental entity? And they said, well, ask yourself, what does it mean to say the guy believes it's going to rain? And what does it mean? Well, you can find out that by asking out how you'd find out if it was true. And one way you'd find out it was true would by watching his behavior, or by asking him a question. Do you believe it's going to rain? And if he says, yeah, that's a form of behavior. Then he's got verbal behavior is behavior like any other kinds of behavior on this view. So the idea is that what his belief amounts to in reality is a set of behavioral acts and behavioral dispositions. That's the whole point of the hypothetical. If he does such and such, if he goes outdoors, he'll carry an umbrella. Okay, objections to behaviorism. Let me go through the objections. Now, what we'll find is that in all of these cases, there are a series of technical objections, and then there is a series of what you might call, or then there's a basic common sense objection. And she just made the common sense objection, namely, if you just talk about behavior, you seem to leave out the mental state. But let me tell you about the technical objections. First, there was one that goes, well, look, the account is really circular because you had to presuppose the mind in order to explain the mind. If you say what it means to say the guy believes it's raining is that if he goes outdoors, he'll carry an umbrella. Yeah, but that's only true if he has a desire, the desire to stay dry. If what he really loves more than anything else is frolicking in the rainstorm and allowing the rain to beat down on his naked body as he dances across the hills of the Bay Area, then he won't carry an umbrella. So you've analyzed belief not in terms of behavior, but in terms of behavior plus desire, and that's circular. That was a serious objection. Another objection was, well, you can't really specify the antecedents of these hypotheticals. What exactly are the conditions that he has to satisfy in order to engage in the appropriate belief behavior? And then a third difficulty, and I think this is also a serious difficulty, in our ordinary sense, we think of the mental state as causing the behavior. It's because the guy has the belief that it's raining and he wants to stay dry that he carries an umbrella. Okay, those are three types of technical objections that were made to behaviorism. But I think the deep objection was it just seems to run against our ordinary notion. That our ordinary notion is the mental state is one thing, the behavior is something else. And one guy, one literary critic who sneered at behaviorism said, in order to be a behaviorist, you got to feign anesthesia. You got to pretend to be anesthetized. And there are any number of bad jokes that philosophy professors, I'll take questions in a minute, any number of bad jokes that philosophy professors told about behaviorism. One of them went, two people after they've just had sex, she says to him, it was great for you, how was it for me? And the point is, if behaviorism were right, then that ought to be the right approach, right? Because what your feelings are a matter of your publicly observable behavior, and other people are in a better position often than you are to know what your behavior is, so they know what your feelings are. So behaviorism didn't seem to be making much progress. Well, how about as a scientific theory? Well, there it really wasn't making much progress either. And the worst failures of behaviorism came in the analysis of language. The idea is that we're going to analyze the psychology of language, psycholinguistics, by looking at people's verbal behavior. Well, and so knowing the meaning of a word, for example, is being disposed to behave in a certain way. But that doesn't really work. If you ask people, well, if you take the word shirt, I happen to have on a shirt. Now, what behavior do you emit when you hear the word shirt? I mean, if I can give you a whole bunch of statements about shirts. Shirts cost less than they used to cost because they're all made in China by people who are underpaid. I now have on a sort of a brown shirt. Shirts were unknown in ancient Rome. As far as I know, no damn Roman ever owned a shirt. You can check this. Okay, now what was the behavior that matched all the occurrences of the word shirt? I don't think there is any behavior that matches this. And the decisive argument against behaviorism was in a long article by Noam Chomsky attacking Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, in which he says the behaviorism is really kind of play acting at science. Yes, behavior plays a role in psychology, but it's like the role that meter readings play in physics. You can find out what's going on in the physical experiment by looking at what the meters say, but nobody would say, well, physics is really a science of meter readings. So on the behavior side, the heroes are Skinner, and in the early days, John Watson was one of the American founders of behaviorism. The objection, the famous objection, was by Chomsky in a review of Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior. I think Chomsky's a bit unfair, but still, the basic message got across, and that is to confuse the behavior with the psychology is to confuse the evidence for the psychology with the psychology itself. So saying that psychology is a science of behavior is like saying psychology is a science of evidence. And it's not. It's the science of the mind. It is the science of what the evidence is evidence for. That was the point of the analogy with physics. Nobody thinks that because we use meter readings as evidence in physics, that's really the subject matter. No, the subject matter is the physical world and its causal properties. Similarly, the subject matter of psychology is the mind, the mental reality, and its causal properties. However, there was a period when if you said that, people would think, well, you're just unscientific. You're back in the 17th century with Descartes. All right, so people of a materialist bent, people who were inclined to materialism, were not satisfied with behaviorism. And behaviorism, I think, was strong in the 40s and 50s. And you can usually tell, as I mentioned last time, by looking at what projects and buildings are named. The Stanford Center is a center in the behavioral sciences. Nobody would call a center that now. They're stuck with its name. Nowadays, it would have to be called the cognitive sciences, or the buzzword would be cognitive information processing neuroscience. And then you're bound to get a research grant if you got all those buzzwords in your name. Many of them are as confused as behavior, but I'll get to that. Right now, we're still back in 40 or 50 years ago. We're getting out of behaviorism into physicalism. There's a version of the mind that says not the mind is behavior. It says the mind just is the brain. And that's called the identity theory. Mental states are identical with physical states. They're identical with states of the brain. So the question was supposed to be, what exactly are mental states really? And the behaviorist said they are forms of behavior, actual and possible. To say that a guy is in a mental state is to say he is behaving, or that he, in a certain way, or he would behave. The materialist of the physicalist bent says no, the mental state just is identical with a state of the brain. Now, one other difference is this. The behaviorist, the logical behaviorist, said that's a matter of the meaning of the words. The meaning of the words is such that the statement, the man is in pain, the man believes that it's going to rain, those are equivalent in meaning to a set of statements about behavior. But the materialist physicalist, the identity theorist, doesn't say they're equivalent in meaning. They just happen to be identical with. According to the identity theorists, look, Descartes might have been right. There might have been spooks, there might have been ghosts, there might have been spirits in addition to the brain, but that's not how the world turned out. The way the world in fact turned out is there's nothing in your skull but your brain, and what we call mental states are just states of the brain. Okay, that is the identity theorist, and the difference between the identity theorist and the behaviorist. And I'm now going to go through the various forms of the identity theory and criticize them. Okay, I saw various hands up. There was a guy at the back, I promised that I'd call on him. Or maybe there was somebody over here. I saw some hands up. Everybody's with me? Okay, no question. Then we're going to go on now and examine different forms of the identity theory. Now, in the early days, the identity theorists said, look, if you take a mental state like being in pain, and you ask yourself what's actually going on in the brain, then they said, well, what's actually happening is that certain types of neuronal structures are firing, and the pain really is identical with C fiber firings. Now, I'm embarrassed to tell you this because it's worse than bad philosophy. It's bad neurobiology. The C fiber is a type of axon. It contrasts, for example, with the A delta fiber, and those are two different types of axons for the transmission of pain signals to the brain. That the idea that the C fibers by themselves should be all there is to having a pain, it's just bad neurobiology. But we're pretending. Okay, C fibers, etc., and all the other crap in the brain that happens when you feel a pain. So I'll get to accurate brain science later. Now we're just back, I guess, in the 60s and 70s maybe we're up to the 80s, where pains are supposed to be C fiber firings. But that's the idea. Any mental state is identical with a state of the brain, and any type of mental state is identical with a type of brain state. C fiber pains just are identical with C fiber firings, and so on with other types of mental states. We'll let the neurobiologists figure out which brain states exactly are identical with which psychological states exactly, but there isn't any question that there is an identity relation. If you don't believe in that, if you believe there's something, as they used to say, over and above the neurobiological, you think there's something over and above brain processes, you are back in bed with Descartes. You're guilty of a dualism. In the early days of the identity theory, I have various friends who are type identity theorists. For some reason I don't understand, it flourished most in Australia. Jack Smart, UT Place, David Armstrong, these are famous type identity theorists. And one of these guys was visiting me when I lived up on Grizzly Peak, and I said, yeah, but look, there are two things going on here. There's the C fiber firing, and then there's the feeling of pain. He shook his head sadly and said, you believe in spooks. You believe in ghosts. It's worse than, he didn't say it's worse than Descartes, but it was pretty bad. He thought, how can you, a civilized person in California, believe in these ghostly entities, these mental phenomena? Anyway, that was the rhetorical strategy, was to think, look, you're forced to a choice. You're either going to choose modern science or you're going to choose ancient superstition. You're going to choose the superstition of centuries ago. Okay, so that's behaviorism. Now, behaviorism, as I said, is that's the a version of materialism, and unlike behaviorism, it doesn't say it's an analytic truth. It's not by definition that mental states are identical with brain states. It's just that's how nature turned out. It just happens when we study mental states, we find they're identical with brain states. Okay, now I'm going to give you the standard objections to the identity theory. But everybody's got it. It just says, it seems very appealing on the face of it. It just says all mental states are identical with states of the brain. And in the simplest version, in the type version, it says for any type of mental state, everybody remembers the type token distinction. You need that for this discussion. The distinction between types and tokens can be illustrated with the following. If I write this on the blackboard, I write the word dog 3 times. Did I write one word or 3? Well, I wrote one type of word, the word dog, but I wrote 3 tokens of that type. A type is an abstract entity. A token is a concrete physical entity. Now, the idea of type identity theory was that for every type of mental state, there is some type of brain state such that every token of that mental state is identical with a token of that physical state. Now, that's the careful way to put it. These guys were not careful. The way they put it, and you can get away with this probably on a final exam. I don't promise you can. But anyway, the way they put it is to say every type of my mental state is identical with a type of physical state. What they meant is, since the only things that really exist are the concrete tokens, what they meant was every token of a type of mental state is identical with a token of a type of physical state. Every token pain is identical with a token C fiber firing. I want you to see the type token distinction because it's going to be important for what follows. Okay, everybody's up with this now. Now, what are the difficulties with this type behaviorism? Well, one set of difficulties are that it seems the mental states have properties that the physical states don't have, and similarly, the physical states have properties that the mental states don't have. Now, we know from Leibniz's law that if 2 things are identical, they must have all of their properties in common. That's called Leibniz's law, after the great German philosopher, mathematician, logician Leibniz. And Leibniz argued the test for whether or not 2 things are identical is that they have all their properties in common. But now mental states have properties that physical states don't have, and physical states have properties mental states don't have, so they can't be identical. The formula for Leibniz's law, or one of many, says if X is identical with Y, that implies that X has the property F if and only if Y has the property F. So X equals Y implies Fx if and only if, this is supposed to be a Y, if and only if F Y. But you can prove that X and Y are not identical. It follows from that if you can show Fx and not Fy, that implies X is not identical with Y. This is the application of Leibniz's law. So if you can show that mind states and brain states have 2 different sets of properties, you can show they're not the same. And these guys, the objections to the identity theorists thought they could show that. So they say, for example, suppose I'm thinking about Paris. Now, let's suppose, according to the identity theorists, that thought is identical with a certain set of neuronal firings in my cortex. Well, now, those neuronal firings will have properties like being 3 centimeters inside my left ear. But the mental state can't have that kind of property. Where is it is not a question that makes sense for the mental state. Or the neurobiological state might have 7 millivolts. It's actually at a force of 7 millivolts that I'm having this thought. But the mental state can't have properties like 7 millivolts. So it looks like if the mental state and the physical states have different properties, they can't be the same. Furthermore, the mental states can have properties like being true or false, pleasant or unpleasant. But an electrical discharge can't be true or false. A neuron firing can't be pleasant or unpleasant. So it looks like the properties of the mind and the properties of the brain are different properties. Therefore, they must be different by Leibniz's law. Okay, now the identity theorists thought they didn't have much of a problem with that objection. They said that's just ignorance. We just don't know enough about our thoughts to know where they're located in the brain and what their electrochemical properties are. But as we come to know more, it will seem perfectly reasonable to say that's where your thought is going on. And on that argument, it seems to me the identity theorists won. As we know more about how the brain works, we are able to locate thoughts in actual spatial locations in the brain. With fMRI, with the imaging techniques we now have, we can see which parts of your brain light up when you think about problems. So it seems to me that the identity theorists won the argument about Leibniz's law. Well, how about things like the following? I have a pain in my toe. Where's the pain? Right there in my toe. But the brain process, that's not my toe. That's up here. That's up here in the body image in the brain. So it can't be that the pain in my toe is really in my brain, because it can't be both places at once. The mental state is in my toe, and the brain process is in my brain. By Leibniz's law, they cannot be identical. Now, that was more of a problem for the identity theorists, but they thought they could handle that, and I think, again, they won this particular argument. What they said is, look, we're not talking about a unique event, the pain, but we're talking about the total experience of having a pain. And a total experience of having a pain in the toe begins with a stimulation of the nerve endings and goes right through to the sensory cortex. It goes right through to the parts of the brain where you actually experience sensations. So it's just ignorance that leads people to say the mental states have properties that the physical states don't have, so the mental states cannot be identical with the physical states. As we get a more sophisticated conception of the brain, a more sophisticated conception of the whole neurobiological system, of the neuronal system, then we'll be able to say exactly what are the processes that constitute having a pain. So it seems to me the Leibniz's law objection failed. There's another objection that I think is more serious, and that's kind of a common sense objection, and that one seems to me to prevail, but I'll tell you about that one in a minute. Let's stop for questions, because I'm going fairly fast. All of this stuff is covered in the reading, but I want you to have a feel for the underlying philosophical urges. The philosophical urges to feel in a consistent scientific account of reality, there cannot be any place for mysterious spiritual entities. There cannot be a place for ghosts and spirits and souls and mental phenomena of an irreducible kind to be wandering around. It all has to be reducible to hard-nosed scientific reality. In the case of mental states, they have to be reducible to states of the brain and the rest of the nervous system, as in the case of the pain, the rest of the central nervous system. But the urge is reductionist. And again, the picture is science is basically reductionist. We've shown that colors really are just variable light reflectances to which our nervous system is responsive to. That liquidity just is a certain type of molecule movement. That solidity just is the vibratory motion of molecules in lattice structures. And that's how it is with consciousness and the mind. They are just reducible to neurobiological properties. That's the driving impulse. Okay, I'm now going to state some more objections. Any questions so far? I'm going fast, but I want everybody to follow me. Yeah. I'm going to come around so I can hear you better. Sorry? Yes, the behaviorist was embarrassed by the fact that they couldn't say the mental states cause the behavior. They just are the behavior. Now, later materialists thought we can answer that. The mental states do cause the behavior. See, the identity theorists can answer that. Your pain just is the C fiber firing, but it causes your pain behavior. The behaviorist couldn't say that. He could not identify the causal relation between the mental and the behavior, because the mental just was the behavior or the disposition of behavior, whereas the materialists think they've got an answer to that. You can have a materialist account that preserves the causal relationship between the mental and behavior, because the mental just is identical with certain neurobiological structures, and those are the structures that cause behavior. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
More of a technical question. Why did they think it was just the brain that causes sensation? Isn't there a whole neural network all throughout?
There is, and they're perfectly willing to grant that. You see, here, let me repeat the question for people at the back. Why just the brain? There's a whole nervous system that's spread throughout the body. And these people were sometimes called central state materialisms. And they thought the central nervous system probably plays a crucial role. But this is a kind of scientific question. It's not a philosophical question. The philosophical question is, it all reduces to neurobiology. Whether or not the neurobiology is all in the skull, or whether or not you're going to need parts of the neurobiology that are not in the skull, that doesn't matter. That's a question for scientific research, not a philosophical issue. So that really didn't worry him. Yes? Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you why we need that distinction. It seemed implausible to many materialists to say that every type of a mental state has to be identical with a type of brain state, because maybe you could have the same mental state in a different type of animal. I can feel a pain, and let's suppose that's my C fiber firing, but let's suppose alligators have a different kind of nervous system, and they feel pains when there's a different type of neurophysiological phenomenon going on. So the materialist said, well, we still keep the identity theory, but it's not that every type mental state is identical with a type of physical state, but every token of a mental state is identical with some token or other of a physical state. And the original type identity theory was accused of neuronal chauvinism. And the idea is that they're committed to the view that only beasts that have neurons like ours can have mental states. And that just seems to be too chauvinistic. Why couldn't other kinds of animals have mental states? And indeed, and this is going to be important, why couldn't computers have mental states even though they don't have neurons? What's this obsession with neurons? Why should we be so chauvinistic about neurons? We're going to build computers. Maybe we already have built computers that have mental states, and those mental states are identical with states of the computer, but the state of the computer is not a neuronal state. So that's led from type identity to token identity. I'll get to that in a few minutes. We're working up to that. Okay, let's go ahead. A second objection to type identity theory was if it's really just a fact about the world that pain is identical with C fiber firing, then there must be two different sets of properties in order to identify the fact in question. There must be the C fiber properties and the pain properties. And the very analogies that the identity theorists used to say that pain is identical with C fiber firing is just like saying water is identical with H2O, or lightning is identical with an electrical discharge. Well, all of those identity statements had two sets of properties on the identity statement. the water properties and the H2O properties, the lightning properties and the passage of electron properties. But then that looks like, if you're going to say it's just a fact about the world that panes are identical with C fiber firings, it looks like you're left with property dualism, because it looks like you've got two sets of properties, the mental properties and the physical properties. And the very form of your argument to say it's just a fact about the world that these are properties of the same entity, that's going to leave you with property dualism, because all the same, they are two different kinds of properties. That, I think, is a more serious objection to the identity theorists. And the way they had of dealing with it is very revealing. What they said is, there aren't any such properties as mental properties. Really, we're going to show that there are no such properties. And how did they do that? Well, the methods were not all that convincing. One method was to say, we can talk about these properties in a topic-neutral vocabulary. So suppose I see an orange after image. I close my eyes and I see an orange after image. Now that orange after image on their account is identical with a set of neuron firings, but it also has mental properties. It's just this orangey thing that I am experiencing. Aha, but they said, you don't have to mention that. You can just say, there's something going on in me, which is like what goes on in me when I see an orange. And that description is topic neutral, because I don't mention the fact that there is some mental phenomenon. The topic neutral description of the mental phenomena doesn't have to mention the mental properties. It's neutral on whether or not there are any such properties. So we're not forced to property dualism. Does everybody get that move? Here's the way the move goes. The first step in the argument is to say, you guys are really property dualists in disguise. You're really property dualists because you're saying one and the same entity has both mental and physical properties. The answer to that is to say there aren't any mental properties. We can always describe these properties without mentioning their mental aspects. We can describe the properties in a topic-neutral vocabulary. Now that seems to me a weak answer. Why? Because the fact that you don't mention the mental properties doesn't show there aren't any mental properties. I mean, I can mention the properties of an airplane without mentioning that it's an airplane. I can just say, look, it's something owned by United Airlines. Well, that doesn't get rid of airplanes. Airplanes are still there. The fact that we don't talk about them doesn't mean they don't exist. And the fact that there's a topic-neutral vocabulary that will enable us to talk about mental states without mentioning the fact that they're mental seems to me irrelevant. So it looks like that's a serious objection to the identity theorist, is that it looks like you're still going to have two different sets of properties. You didn't really get rid of the mental, which was the aim of the exercise. What you did was simply refuse to talk about the specifically mental aspects of mental phenomena. What you did was adopt a vocabulary in which you didn't mention that, but you're still stuck with it. Okay, now a third objection. The Leibniz's law objection doesn't seem to me to work against the type identity theory. Yeah? What they said is, like other parts of science, we're going to do a reduction. When the guy who says that water is just identical with H2O molecules doesn't say water doesn't exist. What he says is, no, water really does exist, but we can reduce it to something else. We can show that it's identical with H2O molecules. Now, this leads to an important distinction. It's going to be important for our later discussion between eliminative reduction and non-eliminative Now, the type of reductions that we're most familiar with in science are typically non-eliminative. Water is identical with H2O molecules. The table is identical with a whole lot of organic molecules. I guess I don't know what the hell tables are, what kind of molecules tables are made out of, but it reduces. But you're not thereby forced to say tables and water don't exist. Some reductions are eliminative. So rainbows can be given an eliminative reduction. Rainbows don't really exist as a separate phenomenon. They are illusions entirely caused by the refractive properties of water vapor in sunlight. And sunsets don't really exist. Sunsets are an illusion created by the rotation of the Earth on its axis. So there are non-eliminative reductions and eliminative reductions. Now the fact is that identity theorists talked as if they were going to do non-eliminative reductions, but in the end, and I think this is they're forced to this by the considerations I just mentioned, they're forced to a kind of eliminative reduction when they say really, well, there aren't any special irreducible mental properties. There are just the properties of C fiber firings, etc. Okay, a third objection is one I mentioned briefly, and that's more serious. They took this one more seriously. It looks like you're forced to neuronal chauvinism. It looks like you're forced, if you say every type of mental state is identical with a type of brain state, you're forced to say only systems that have this type of brain state can have this type of mental state. And that seems chauvinistic because animals might have it, or we might build machines that had mental states. Even among human beings, it seems too much to say that whenever you and I are in exactly the same mental state, we must be in exactly the same brain state. I believe that Denver is the capital of Colorado. Let's suppose you also believe that Denver is the capital of Colorado. My belief that Denver is the capital of Colorado might be encoded in one part of my brain, but it might be encoded in your brain in a different way. Who cares? It doesn't matter if they're encoded differently. The point is that all that's going on in both cases, according to the identity theorist, is that there is some specific token of a brain state in you and a specific token of a brain state in me, and those two tokens are identical with tokens of a type of mental state, the belief that Denver is the capital of Colorado. So to avoid neuronal chauvinism, we go from type identity to token identity. It's sometimes called type identity. We go to token identity. And token identity says every token mental state is identical with a token of some physical state. And that gets rid of the chauvinism. That allows that it needn't even be a brain state. It could be a state of a computer. It could be a state of anything, provided only that what? Well, that's the next question. If the tokens are not tokens of the same type, then what fact about them makes them tokens of the same mental state? Different token physical states can be different types of tokens of different types of physical states can both be token of the same type of mental state. What fact about them makes them tokens of that type? That's the next question. Okay, now we come to a great breakthrough in the materialist philosophy of mind, and that is called functionalism. And functionalism said, well, look, ask yourself how we actually identify mental states, and you will see that we identify them in terms of their causal relationships. And one way to put that is to say we identify them in terms of their function. So let's take that example of the guy who believes that it's raining, and for that reason he carries an umbrella. if we were going to analyze the causal relations, function here means causal function. We're going to analyze the functional relations. We could say he has the belief that it's raining. I'll just abbreviate that as rain. And he has the desire to stay dry. And those two together cause that he carries an umbrella. We'll just abbreviate that as carry. So it's the action of carrying an umbrella that are caused by the belief that it's raining and the desire to stay dry. It's the act of he believes rain, desires to stay dry, and the act is that he carries, let's say, an umbrella. Okay, so this is going to be the belief and the desire cause the act of carrying an umbrella. Now then, what is a belief really? Well, it's something that stands in those causal relations. Furthermore, the belief will itself be caused by other things. So, for example, the belief will be caused by the perception. So the perception that it's raining will cause the belief that it's raining. I abbreviate that as perception that rain causes the belief that it's raining, and that together with a desire to stay dry will cause the act of carrying an umbrella. And that is, then if we're going to spill that out, there'll be other things. He'd have to believe, for example, that if he carries an umbrella, he can stay dry. Okay, now they ask the question, what is a belief really? A belief is anything that stands in these causal relations. And that view is called functionalism. Functionalism says, what is a mental state really? It is a functional state of a system where the functional state is designed by causal relations. You identify what the belief is really by asking yourself, what causes the belief and what does it cause? And then there's a wonderful formal device called a Ramsey sentence, where you just knock out the words that bother you and substitute variables of quantification. So instead of saying the guy's got a belief that's caused by rain and the belief together with a desire cause an act, you just say there is an X such that the perception of rain causes X, and X together with a desire to stay Y, to stay dry, causes the act. So there just is this X that stands in these causal relations. It's caused by perceptions, and together with desires, it causes action. Now that's what a belief is. A belief is anything that can stand in the right causal relation. And now notice, we get rid of the objection to behaviorism that it was circular, because we do the same number on the desire. The desire is just a Y. There is an X and there is a Y, such that the perception that it's raining causes X, and the desire, and Y, which is the desire to stay dry, causes the act. Those together cause the act of carrying an umbrella. So the basic idea is this. You don't have to ask yourself, what is a belief really? What is a desire really? They're anything that stand in these causal relations. Beliefs are caused by perceptions, and together with desires, they cause actions. So anything that stands in the right causal relations can be a belief. And we have a machine that has precisely these causal properties. It's called a computer. You can feed the stuff into the machine, and if it's programmed in the right way, it will send out the right output. So if we ask the question, well, what fact about these X's and Y's makes them behave the way they do, it looks like we've got an answer to that. They are states of a computer system, and given the right program, they will be caused by certain inputs, and then given the rest of the computer system, they will cause certain outputs. Okay, so now we're moving from type-type identity theory to token-token identity theory. If you ask the question, what fact about the tokens make them the mental states that they are, the natural answer is their causal relations. And so now it looks like you can identify the mental states with their causal relations. And if you then ask the next question, how does it work? Well, it looks like we know the answer to that. They are the functional states, are states of a computer system. And that's why this view is sometimes called computer functionalism. Now I'm going to get to that, but I saw some hands up, so let's take question. I think you were first. Yeah.
If beliefs are caused by perceptions, what are desires caused by?
Well, all kinds of things. Your upbringing, psychology. I can't put everything on the blackboard. If I was one of these guys, I would say, look, I'm just giving you the schema here. Desires are caused by your physiological structure. A lot of us don't like to get wet, but also we have a certain kind of upbringing. We don't want to run around with a lot of wet clothes on, so we got all this stuff that causes us of desire. So you have the cause of the belief and the cause of the desire, and together the belief and the desire cause the action. That's the picture. You don't get a simple answer. What causes desires? In a way that you get a simple answer question. What causes people to believe that it's raining? Well, for example, seeing that it's raining, being told that it's raining, hear the rain on the roof, something like that. But there will be causes of both. Yes, you had a question.
Can you go over the basic difference between behaviorism?
Yes. This is a crucial question. What's the basic difference between functionalism and behaviorism? Now, I don't want to give these guys credit for more precision than they actually had. And often the same guy would believe all this stuff. So they wander around from one view to another. What they're anxious is avoid Cartesianism. And then it says avoid dualism at all costs. You think, all costs? Even saying something false? Answer, well, I won't tell you the answer just yet. Okay, but the difference is this. The behaviorist says there's just the behavior. That's it. But the functionalist is able to say something the behaviorist can't say. The mental state causes the behavior. So two objections to behaviorism are met by the functionalist. First of all, the behaviorist looks like he was guilty of circularity because he had to postulate desires. Desires together with beliefs produce action. But the functionalist said, that's fine. We're going to give a functional analysis of belief and a functional analysis of desire in one fell swoop. But furthermore, the objection to the behaviorist was, but you can't explain the causal relations if all there is behavior. What causes the behavior? How does the mental cause the behavior? The functionalist says, that's the essence of my theory. The mental states are identical with their causal powers. What is a belief really? It's just anything that stands in these causal relations. So the two basic differences here are that in the case of the behaviorist looks like you can't do the analysis of belief without mentioning desire, because it's only the belief and the desire together. That doesn't bother the functionalist at all. I'm going to do them both at once. But furthermore, says the functionalist, I'm going to be able to meet the second objection to behaviorism, namely they can't describe the causal relations, because that's exactly what the definition of the mental state is. It's anything that stands in the right causal relations. You had your hand up. Yeah.
Would it be a functionalist have to say that these desires and perceptions and things occupy real estate in the brain?
Yes. They are all states of the brain. Now, this is why all of this stuff is versions of token-token identity theory. Functionalism is a way of dealing with the problems of token-token identity theory, and I can tell you in one sense what is the problem. The type identity theorist could answer the question, what fact about my brain state makes it the belief that Denver's the capital of Colorado? And the answer is that belief is always exemplified in a certain type of brain state. But the token identity theorists can't say that because the brain state's going to be all over the lot. What fact about these different token brain states makes them all tokens of the same type of mental state? And the functionalist has a great answer to that. The answer is same function. They all perform the same causal relation. Now I have to tell you, by the way, I'm a bit like Voltaire trying to explain the Catholic Church. I don't believe any of this, but I want you to see how it can appeal to a lot of smart people. And I have to say, I think most philosophers today are functionalists. I dread going to look at the latest issues of the journals because there's more functionalism running around the woods than you can possibly imagine, though that's being replaced by even sillier views. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there is a problem for functionalism with irrationality. And how about the guy who says, yeah, I do want to stay dry, I don't want to get wet, but what the hell? And then he rushes out. But irrationality is a problem for all of us. I mean, yes, there are all kinds of bugs in the system. And I think any computer scientist would feel, well, that's all right. We get bugs in the system. A bug that you know about is called a feature. And it's used in selling the product. In the early days of phone answering machines, I bought a machine from Panasonic that had a lousy chip, and you couldn't recognize your own voice. So they listed as one of its features, disguises your voice, okay? Meaning they didn't know how to make it any better than that. Okay, now once again, we stand on the verge of the great breakthrough in the past century when we discover the brain is a digital computer and the mind is a digital computer program. Computer functionalism. We'll talk about that on Thursday.